Howdy, everybody. Most of you know I'm Chris Lane. I'm a professor at the Bush School, and the director of the Scowcroft Institute, Andrew Natsios, was kind enough to ask me to introduce our guest tonight, Dr. Josef Joffe, and I am privileged to do so because we are all very fortunate to have a guest of his eminence here at the Bush School. And speaking from personal experience, having come back from Europe about 2 weeks ago, it seems that the older you get, the harder and harder it is to go across the pond. And it's a long way from Germany over here, so we should be all very honored that Dr. Joffe has come to speak with us. This is a man that I know personally, not well, not as well as I'd like to, but we've run into each other at a few conferences along the way. And he's a man with an extraordinary background. First, look at the job he presently holds as editor of Zeit, which is one of the most influential, I would say probably the most influential magazine in the Federal Republic of Germany. Prior to that, he had an outstanding career in both journalism and academia. He used to be a columnist and op-ed page editor for the Süddeutsche Zeitung, one of the most influential newspapers in Germany. And I think what makes him truly exceptional is here's someone, I guess the term that I would use, he is binational. He's German, but he was educated in the United States, has his PhD from Harvard, master's from Johns Hopkins, and a bachelor's degree from Swarthmore. He's taught here at Harvard and Princeton and Johns Hopkins and Dartmouth, and also at the University of Munich. So this amazing combination of journalism and academic rigor. And if I sat here and read off everything that he's published, he wouldn't have any time to speak. No, I know, don't worry. But I just very quickly say, every major outlet that publishes articles on international affairs and foreign policy, he has been in. International security, foreign affairs, foreign policy, the national interest, and many others besides, op-eds in all the major newspapers, starting with the New York Times, and the author of several books, including his new book, which is just out. Yes? Already out? Next month, with W.W. Norton. And you'll know that Dr. Joffe and I don't always see eye to eye on the issues, because his book is The Myth of America's Decline. So, please, welcome to the Bush School.
Thank you very much, Chris. That was the best introduction I've had in the last 5 minutes. And he was right. You may about jet lag. You may encounter a real first in the history of speaker-audience relationships. This is like 3 o'clock for me now in the morning. And so you'll experience, you could say, I was there when it happened, which is when the speaker falls asleep before the audience does. So I'm going to have to hurry up. And we'll get into the theme, which is World War I, and past that will not pass away. World War I, a historian who's now forgotten, he called World War I the largest event in human history. And the numbers are indeed, World War II, as in World War II, 80 million dead, 55 civilian. And yet, I would argue that World War I was more consequential. And I'll try to explain to you why, and we can discuss it later, whether it's a correct take or not. But because World War I transformed history in ways which are still all around us 100 years later, and the fallout keeps on working. Just take the civil war in Syria. Its roots are buried in World War I, the great empire slayer. The Great War killed the Ottoman Empire, leaving the Middle East in the hands of Britain and France, and while carving up the carcass, they slapped together all these hodgepodge states like Syria, which imprisoned precisely those tribes and creeds and nationalities fighting it out to the death today. So that's a very nice illustration of what I'm trying to argue. The effects still keep reverberating. And of course, Syria is just one part of the Great War's legacy. So let me look at the entire aftermath, the military, political, economic, and cultural consequences that keep reverberating. First, let's talk about the new nature of war. And I'd like to just quickly touch upon two misconceptions by arguing that World War I was neither the first modern nor the first global war. The first global war, for history buffs, is the 7 Years' War in the 18th century, also known as the French and Indian War in this country. In fact, the 7 Years' War started here 2 years earlier, and which pretty much embroiled all the great powers and small powers of Europe, which was fought all over the place. It was fought in North and South America, it was fought in Europe, of course, Africa, India, and on the high seas. And when it was over, French power was broken, and the world had kind of become English. Nor was World War I really the first modern war, because every weapon, almost every weapon of mass destruction, save the tank and poison gas, was already on stage in the American Civil War. The breech-loading rifle, the machine gun, the rifled cannon, the ironclad, the submarine, aerial warfare. Add to these the force multipliers of railroad, telegraph, and of course the universal draft, which allowed for mass armies and for the rapid deployment. That already happened in the Civil War. Add trench warfare, where thousands were killed just to advance a few feet, a few hundred feet. Add also scorched earth tactics like Sherman's march through Georgia to the sea, which foreshadowed the area bombardment of World War II. But the greatest force multiplier already working in the American Civil War was the nation state and nationalism. Unlike the princes and potentates who had to rely on very expensive professional armies, the nation state could suddenly mobilize millions for a sacred national cause, for an idea. And in that respect, too, the Civil War was the first 20th century war. So Gettysburg and Chancellorsville were the dress rehearsals for the Marne and Verdun. Can we give me some staggering figures of what the new nature of warfare in World War I? It took 30 British shells to kill 1 German during the Battle of the Somme. In a single day at Verdun, 2 million shells were fired during an 8-hour period. This toll, in the end, the war changed nothing territory-wise. There were no real victories, no real conquests. So this toll, little gain and astronomic pain, left a strategic legacy that would shape the rest of the 20th century. And let me read to you part of a poem by Wilfred Owen, an English poet, who describes that experience I just mentioned in these statistical terms, if you wish, describes the experience in the Anthem for a Doomed Youth. What passing bells for these who die as cattle, only the monstrous anger of the guns, only the stuttering rifles' rapid rattle, can patter out the hasty orisons, the shrill demented choirs of wailing shells and bugles calling for them from sad shires. Attritional warfare, which he describes here, became the destiny of the 20th century. In Stalingrad, in the Pacific, the US and Japan, later in the China and Korea, then in the Iran-Iraq war of the 1980s. But the grinding death mill of World War I also bred a very different strategy, which also extended all the way into the 20th century, which is as follows. While the French sought safety in ever more massive defenses like like the Maginot Line, the German Wehrmacht drew exactly the opposite conclusion. Offense over defense, and by 1939, of course, it was blitzkrieg and panzer armies and attack bombers lunging forward without stopping. And of course, as you know, this new strategy, which was kind of born from the experiences of World War I, enabled the Wehrmacht to break France and Poland in a matter of weeks and propelling it all the way to Cairo and Moscow. But the story didn't end there. In the Six-Day War, the Israelis, who had studied Guderian, went the Germans one better. They raced to the Suez Canal in only 5 days. Never mind the supply lines. So that too grew, late 20th century strategy grew out of that war. This ends the first part, namely what were the strategic effects and legacy of that war. Let me now talk about point 2, which are the social and political consequences. How are we going to count the ways? Outside of Britain, the US and France, the immediate aftermath was revolution, which would reverberate through the 20th century. And here's an interesting miscalculation. The leaders of Europe, who had thought that war would suppress class and nationality conflict, reaped exactly the opposite. It was revolution from Portugal to Poland, from Ireland to Turkey, from Scandinavia, Finland, to Arabia, and of course in Germany and Russia. The war triggered both nationalist rebellion and societal revolt in ways that would change the map and the politics of Europe for the rest of the 20th century. So at war's end, constitutional monarchy had lost its grip on Europe, on European history. Yet what we had expected, the middle class, the bourgeoisie, in the ascendant since mid-19th century, did not end up in the saddle. Democratic revolutions were soon captured by tyrants worse than yesterday's royals, from Bolshevism to fascism. And by the way, it wasn't the Great Depression which slammed shut freedom's door. With the exception of the Nazi Revolution, which did win during the Depression, all the other fascist authoritarian revolutions had taken place in good times, in the 20s, like Mussolini, who wins in 1922 in Italy. At any rate, so this war turns into regime killer, but it was also the false dawn of democracy. Who was another winner? Another winner was the closed nation state, which took us another 50 years before we could start talking about globalization in the 70s. Again, the difference between pre and post-war was staggering. Before the war, you could travel throughout Europe without a passport, except to Russia. Free trade was the reigning creed. Freedom of movement for capital as well. After the war, the nation state clams up and doesn't really reopen until the 70s or so, as tariffs went down and free trade and so on. Recall another bad thing that would last with lasting consequences. In 1921, the United States began to restrict immigration, closing a safety valve that had taken the pressure of Europe's class conflicts for a whole century. This was, of course, part and parcel of America's retraction from the world, and that closing door of immigration may well have stoked Europe's revolutionary fires. But of course, the effects of America's strategic withdrawal were worse by orders of magnitude. Now recall that Woodrow Wilson had wanted to make, as we all know, make the world safe for democracy, which should actually read, make the world safe through democracy. According to this classical liberal creed that said only good, that is democratic states, make good foreign policy, and good states, Wilson thought, would also follow from self-determination. If all nationalities, Poles, Czechs, Hungarians, had their own countries, then they would live in harmony ever after. But as you also know, the Wilsonian dream turned into a nightmare. Where empires had once imposed order on restless peoples, all these newly independent nations of Europe suddenly found themselves stuck with unhappy minorities and revisionist claims. Here too, the story continued into the late 20th century when Yugoslavia, another child of the 1919 settlement, exploded in war. Now, democracy was not to be in the havoc wrought by World War I, because into that vacuum stepped the totalitarians and authoritarians nourished by a myriad national grievance. The established powers, exhausted and demoralized by the war, proved unable to maintain a balance of power. Only one nation, the United States, had remained intact, but that linchpin of the post-war European order was pulled out in a paroxysm of American nationalism. Now, why the tragedy of the interwar period? I want to repeat. Above all, the Great War was the greatest empire slayer of all time. Down went the Romanov Empire, the Wilhelmine Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and the Habsburg Empire. And the world is still being shaken by the aftershocks. Now, the Bolshevik Revolution was a direct result of World War I, and so was, of course, the Nazi Revolution, though about one step removed. And both of these revolutions, children of the war, put an indelible stamp on the 20th century. You know, Stalinism, which was totalitarianism plus frenzied industrialization, turned Russia for the first time in history into a global power. And you know how that story unfolded in the 20th century. It was Soviet Russia versus the United States, embroiled in a 40 years war, also known as the Cold War, which lasted until the Soviet Union committed suicide in 1991. So the Cold War, you can argue, was also, though at one step removed, a child, a bastard child, an ugly child of the World War I. Now, Weimar Germany, also born in the Great War, tried democracy for 15 years, only to fall to Nazism, the most terrifying engine of destruction the world has ever seen. And it took the world's combined might to stop this death machine. But Bolshevism and Nazism were just the most monstrous progeny of World War I. As I said, again, much of Europe fell prey to their smaller brothers. Fascism and authoritarianism swept Iberia and Central Europe, Austria, Hungary, Romania, Poland, and the Spanish and the Portuguese dictatorships lasted until 1975. So how is that for a long-run effect? So no war in history has had such a fatal impact on so many societies for such a long time. Now, the Ottoman and the Habsburg empires have disappeared from history, as you know, but not without momentous consequences, even in their death. And they're still with us like a slow-acting poison. I've already mentioned to you one venomous legacy was Yugoslavia, this artificial state cobbled together from the remains of those two empires in 1919. It collapsed in internecine war in the 1990s and was stopped only by NATO intervention. and there are now 7 states instead of 1. But former Yugoslavia is sheer heaven compared to that vast swath to the south and the east, where the Ottomans had maintained order for 4 centuries. And the best book on the noxious legacy is still David Fromkin's The Peace to End All Peace. It came out about 20 years ago. By 1922, he writes, he relates, the European powers had carved up the Turkish Empire from the Balkans to Basra, in Iraq, today's Iraq, drawing the borders of the contemporary Middle Eastern state system. And here's what Fromkin argues. The Middle East, he writes, turned into the witch's brew of world politics because the European powers undertook to reshape it and because Britain and France failed to ensure that the political system they established would permanently endure. They destroyed the old order irrevocably. They smashed Turkish rule of the Arabic-speaking Middle East beyond repair. They created countries, nominated rulers, delineated frontiers, and so planted all the conflicts inside and out that have been tormenting the world ever since. Now, of course, the British and the French ultimately disappeared during decolonization, leaving behind monarchies imposed on non-nations where loyalties belonged to creeds, nationalities, tribes, and clans. For a few decades, the built-in strife was contained by a long line of strongmen. Nasser to Mubarak in Egypt, the Assad family, a kind of dynastic dictatorship in Syria, Saddam's Tikriti clan in Iraq, Gaddafi in Libya, the revolutionaries in the rest of the Maghreb. So barely contained conflict on the inside was projected outward, with successive contenders fighting it out for intra-Arab hegemony or leading the battle against Israel. And I think that Samuel Huntington, my teacher and then my friend, had it wrong when he depicted Islam as the key driver, Islam, the religion, the culture, of his clash of civilizations. In fact, the main conflict lines are within Islam. What Neil Ferguson has called a civilization of clashes. And they are far bloodier than between Orient and Occident. Now, with the strongmen gone, it is the war of each against all, from the Levant to Algeria. The Arab world is now a cauldron of failing or failed states. Again, the poisoned fruit of the peace to end all peace 100 years ago. Let me now make a large leap from strategy, politics, to look at culture in the widest sense. What has World War I done to our minds, so to speak, to the way we perceive and interpret the world? I would call this, the subheading here, I would call this the death of optimism. Let me explain what I mean. If we step back a couple of centuries to the Enlightenment of the 18th century, from the Enlightenment to the eve of World War I, historical optimism ran rampant in the West. Whether in its liberal guise or in its Marxist guise, historical optimism was the creed, the reigning creed, that depicted history as the march out of misery and toward a kind of secular version of Eden. Yesterday was the veil of tears and oppression. Tomorrow, the age of reason and freedom would dawn. The Eiffel Tower, the Crystal Palace, were built as soaring cathedrals to the faith in bigger and better and forevermore. Reason, a shorthand for science and man's mastery over nature, did indeed triumph along with industrialization and explosive growth. But the massacre that was World War I marked the turning point in our kind of mental history, as it were, or collective mental history, the knowledge that raised the Eiffel Tower also gave the machine gun to the West, allowing one man to mow down 100 without stopping for reloading. 19th century chemistry turned out all these blessings from petroleum to plastics and pharmaceuticals that made the modern world. But, as we know, the same labs also invented poison gas, which we have encountered again recently in Syria, where part of the arsenal is still the kind of stuff that used to be used in World War I. But worse than that, freedom's march wasn't only stopped, but reversed. As we know, we learned democracy was flattened by the totalitarians from Mussolini to Mao, and utopia in the here and now, as promised by the Enlightenment, died in the process. After all, how would you reason about perfectibility of man and politics once the totalitarians had twisted hope into hell on earth? Their utopia was the gulag and the death camp, and the road to salvation in the here and now led into a war which claimed 55 million civilian lives. So the point is that optimism, the reigning creed for the last 200 years or so, was pushed aside by pessimism and cultural despair. The title of one of Freud's best-known essays says it all: Civilization and its Discontent. Thomas Mann in Buddenbrooks chronicles the decline of bourgeois society. Look at the distance between the gaiety of French Impressionism and the dispirited message of German Expressionism in the paintings of George Grosz and the films of Fritz Lang. After World War I, Oswald Spengler, the German high priest of doom, ranted in his best-selling The Decline of the West against, quote, unbridled optimism that sets at naught all historical experience. In England, Fort Maddox Ford, D.H. Lawrence and their colleagues at the English Review, this is a cause for optimism here, and their colleagues at the English Review were musing that civilization was ruined for good. Their heroes and their novels ended as damaged men, demoralized and disillusioned. Now, it didn't get much better as the 20th century progressed. One by one, the heroes of the 18th and 19th centuries ended up on Western culture's most wanted list: industry, technology, and science. Suddenly, the very idea of progress had, quote, become a lethal idée fixe, irreversibly destroying the planet, end of quote, growled the appropriately named Death of Progress, a book that typified the tone of the 70s. In the 80s, suddenly the nuclear bargain with the devil moved to the fore. In his best-selling Fate of the Earth, Jonathan Schell predicted only animals would survive nuclear war. The only animals which would survive it was, quote, the insect class. Another curse of Faustian man was nuclear winter. Following a nuclear exchange, a smoke and particle-laden atmosphere would thrust the world into a new ice age. It's not that long ago, it's not just before global warming in the 80s. In the 90s, of course, nature would inflict the opposite revenge on the children of Prometheus. Having unleashed the fossil-fueled fire of industry, they were now reaping global warming, and their punishment would be environmental apocalypse, melting ice caps, drowning coastal cities that would dwarf the deluge. Grossing $125 million, the movie The Day After Tomorrow, Hollywood's 2004 take on the end of the world, had it both ways. First, global warming would inundate the globe, and then deep freeze it. There was no way out. It was death by fire, water, and ice, and you might say the demise of logic as well. I submit that this secular turn from optimism to doomism, from Marx was a historical optimist, from Marx to Freud is rooted in the horrors of the battlefields of Flanders and the totalitarian age that followed. And I submit that it all began in that long, hot summer of 1914 when the world fell apart. Last point number 4, conclusion. The question is, I'm going to pose, is there anything good that came from World War I? Any good sermon has to have a good ending. I've dwelt at great length on the gruesome legacy of the Great War and argued that it continues to darken the world we live in today. Still, there is no conflict, and that's the last thought I would like to leave you with. There's no conflict that doesn't breed beneficial changes. I told you how the technology that gave us poison gas and the machine gun. Allow me a lighter note right now from the war, the technology of the war, and to highlight the opposite dynamic. During the war, a German by the name of Ferdinand Porsche invented the four-wheel drive for military vehicles that almost brought Germany victory on the Italian front. Now, thanks to her Porsche, we now have not only one of the world's finest sports cars, but also the four-wheel drive SUV that now takes us to the local Safeway in all of its four-wheel splendor, especially in Texas where not a single snowflake has ever dropped. Now back to let's be serious again. I'm almost done. I'm actually doing okay time-wise, more or less. No, I'm not. So, on a more serious note, remember that World War I was not only the first mass-based war, but also the first one to involve women on a large scale who died by the thousands, though not in a fighting capacity. So when they came back, they claimed their due. So in Britain, they were granted voting rights in 1918. In the US, the franchise came in 1920, and in Germany, also in 1919. Back to Britain. At the beginning of the war, home ownership in Britain had barely changed since feudal times. Only about 10% of the population were owner-occupiers. After the 1918 elections, appropriately nicknamed, quote, Homes Fit for Heroes election, unquote, 1 million council houses were built under the Housing Act. So on the eve of World War II, ownership had tripled to 30%. So the point of these tidbits, and there are lots of them, that I want to make is a larger one. Mass participation in war breeds mass participation in peace. The upside downside. Democracy, as I had argued, didn't exactly triumph in Europe after 18, but the foundation was laid in a war that mobilized entire nations. Thereafter, the genie could not be stuffed back into the bottle of monarchical rule. And the same thing happened in World War II in the US. Blacks made a large leap forward in World War II. In 1947, President Truman abolished racial discrimination in the armed forces. So the moral of mass warfare is this: the state that needs its citizens will have to give unto its citizens. And hence the great historical irony of World War I, fought to preserve dynastic power, it opened it opened the floodgates to mass participation. And the German philosopher Hegel would call this the cunning of history. Let me conclude at last with a very basic point about what the war has wrought in a with its very long-term effects. That war marked the beginning of the modern age. If by modernity we mean the full bloom of the nation-state, the dawn of mass-based democracy, and the steamroller of industrialization that was cranked up in Britain in the 19th century. Nonetheless, one last thought. The West's great faith in progress was forever shattered in the trenches, and I think we can still feel it today, the way we think about the world. So, in ultimate conclusion, let me conclude with the last lines of a poem that makes the point about the death of optimism by the English writer Philip Larkin, titled 1914. And just 3 lines out of it. Never such innocence, never before since, never such innocence again. End of quote, end of speech, beginning of applause. These people hung in for over an hour.
They did. Well, no, not for over an hour. They hung in for about 40 minutes.
Okay.
That's, that seems like a reasonable, reasonable amount for a reception.
We are the last thing that stands between.
Oh, I know, and I'm very, very conscious of that. Trust me. Dr. Joffe, thank you very, very much for that talk, which dovetails so nicely with what some of the people in the first couple of rows and many of you out in the audience have been hearing about for the last 2 days as part of the 1914 and the Making of the 20th Century conference that we've been holding in conjunction with a number of partners, the Scowcroft Institute here at the Bush School, the College of Liberal Arts, the Department of History, the Melbourne Glasscock Center for Humanities Research. This has really been an astonishing and productive last 2 days. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Adam Zeit. I'm here from the Department of History, and I'm just enormously proud to be here as the fellow person in the comfortable chair, talking to Dr. Joffe here after this really exceptional.
I'm enormously proud to sit on this most beautiful of rugs.
This is a beautiful rug, there's no question. I wanted to take fellow comfortable chair privileges, and before we started with the Q&A, to put a proposition to you, okay. I suppose a 2-part related proposition. The first is that I was struck by one of the things that you said right at the very beginning, which is obvious and true and important, that in a way the era of before the First World War is an era that's wrapped in a kind of gaudy haze. It was a remarkable era. It's also an era that in some ways looks not unlike the Europe of today, where it's possible to go from Portugal to the border of the former Soviet Union without ever taking out your passport, which is somewhat remarkable. We have, in a sense, rediscovered after fascism and Nazism and World War and Cold War that there is such a thing as Central Europe, that Germany can be a peaceful, powerful, if not uncontested, principal actor in a place called Central Europe that can be peaceful and prosperous and cosmopolitan. That in a sense, we're living in an age that's both moving away from the First World War and reminding us of what was lost in the First World War, and that this might be, particularly in Central Europe, a cause for a certain nostalgia, but a kind of nostalgia that isn't nationalistic or dangerous or revanchist, but that is positive and cosmopolitan. So I thought I would at least put that to you before we open the floor.
What's the question?
No, it was a proposition.
Okay,
it's offered as a proposition.
Okay. This proposition I wouldn't push too far because you know why? Because we have all this interdependence and all this interpenetration and all this freedom of trade and capital movement. I wouldn't push it to the utmost and say that there's a new World War I in the offing, right?
I hope not.
No. But we very much had that kind of interdependence and Europeanness. 100 years ago, the Brits and the Germans were each other's second best customers in 1913. And there was this European civilization, a European upper class that talked to each other. I think in those days it was French. So this is a remarkable return to a status quo antebellum, as it were. But of course, it's a very different, and you're right, for the first time since the rise of Prussia, Germany, beginning with Frederick the Great in the 18th century, the Germans are now safely embedded in this larger Europe. Strangely enough, some of the old problems with Germany are back on the agenda. This old saw about Germany being too strong for Europe, but not strong enough to impose itself on Europe. Here's Empress Angela trying to teach the rest of Europe, German fiscal probity and virtue in the management of their budgets. And lo and behold, she can't do it, just like previous Germanys. But to conclude, there is, of course, the differences between 1913 and 2013 are just overwhelming. We talked about this afternoon. The glorification of war is gone. What Tocqueville did call in the Democracy in America, the poetical excitement of arms that used to motivate men to go to war and to self-sacrifice in the name of honor, duty, and country. The two wars of the 20th century have knocked that out of the Europeans once and for all. And so the most exciting conflicts we have is about whatever regulation on the curvature of cucumbers the European Commission can think up, or about light bulbs. They prescribed light bulbs about 3 years ago. My biggest problem, and that's maybe something that can be discussed in next year's colloquium, is what I call a post-democratic phenomenon, that Europe is no longer really governed by its sovereign parliaments, but by the system embodied in the Commission, or by the European Central Bank. We have outsourced politics to non-democratic institutions like the Commission or the European Central Bank. And thank God they were there, because the governments couldn't have acted.
Thank you very much. I want to open up the floor to questions and comments. If you can come down to one of the microphones that's down here at the bottom, and if you could just briefly identify yourself, that'd be great.
And social security number.
Yeah. Not all at once.
They're hungry, they're getting hungry.
Yeah, well, they have to work for their supper.
Yes, something good came out of it. The end of any idea that that authoritarian or totalitarian government is somehow superior to democratic government. So in that respect, the Nazis were good stuff. But it cost a lot for that comprehension to settle in. You're not talking about Autobahns, are you?
Well, just anything in general, really. We sort of just got to the rise of the Nazis, and but I have a German friend there. The Corps of Cadets actually has 4 Germans who are here for the semester.
In the Corps?
Yes, sir. They're
wearing
doing
American
German exchange
uniforms?
program.
Wearing American uniforms?
No, so they wear their uniforms.
You know what we did to Germans wearing American uniforms in the war? I have a great story, may I tell it?
Please do.
Henry Kissinger was taken out of boot camp into the CIC in Belgium in the Ardennes battle. And since he knew German, he was supposed to sniff out Germans in American uniform behind the lines. And so, how did you do it? He said, well, we had to develop very complicated passwords. So what kind of passwords? He says, well, obviously we used baseball. But Henry didn't know anything from baseball. Oh, no, he said, I knew everything about baseball. The moment I set foot in Washington Heights, I studied up everything. I read the books. I went to every game. Unfortunately, he said, I knew all the right answers, but they kept arresting me because I had the wrong accent. Go ahead. No, I think this is what came out of it, out of that war altogether, was a kind, not just the exhaustion after World War I, but a kind of sense that Europe had to put its internal relationship on a different footing. And that's what set in motion the process of integration, coal and steel community, all this kind of stuff. So of course the World War II had enormous consequences, and some of them have been quite benign, like the one I just mentioned, not to speak of the Autobahns. But you had Autobahns in America too. But at the same time, they emerged about the same time, 1936, I think the Pennsy Turnpike, under democratic regimes. So you don't need a totalitarian regime to have Autobahns.
Is it on? Can you hear me? Okay. My name is Amber Stotts. I'm a second year here at the Bush School. Great talk. We're so happy to have you here. Thank you so much.
You have good taste, thank you.
You know, what really struck me about when you were talking is how much the Great War really changed the nature of, I mean, really everything to do with international politics in the world. And I've also read some of your work on alliances, and I was hoping to hear from you how you thought the Great War and even World War II may have changed the nature of alliance politics and how states grapple with the attempt to survive and avoid such catastrophe. If that makes sense.
That's a big one.
I have been thinking about
First
it
of
for a
all,
while.
first of all, one of the problems after the war was that the great alliances fell apart. The Entente, the Russian, Franco-Russian, Anglo-Franco-Russian, and I think plus of course the Americans in there. I think the disintegration of that alliance within about 3 years by 1922 left the kind of vacuum in Europe which paved the way to the rise of Nazi Germany. And I think so. I wish this alliance had stayed intact, especially with the United States. In Europe, I think maybe it would have prevented the greatest horrors of world history. And I think we learned that thing. We learned the lesson after World War II, when the United States, of course, did not abandon Europe. Quite the opposite. It committed itself to maintaining 6 divisions permanently. It took over the alliance. It recruited members. It made sure that the alliance stayed cohesive, and in the process provided the two pillars of the great European miracle. That alliance allowed the reintegration of Germany under America's aegis. Suddenly there was a power in the game bigger and mightier than the French and the Germans, and it could insure each other against their misplaced credulity, and it held the Soviets at bay. And behind those walls, or under that umbrella, where the United States assured guaranteed security, democracy could flourish, as it couldn't in the interwar period, where it was easy for the seducers to manipulate whatever external threat there may or may not have been in order to suppress democratic participation. So that's my short, quick take on your question.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. It was a good question, good answer.
My name is Jay Breakfield. I'm a retired newspaper guy and interested in history. There seems to be a school of thought that World War I was an avoidable conflict. I've even, I forget which historian said it, but I remember seeing a historian interviewed that said when he got deep enough into studying the run-up to World War I, he found moments where if somebody had made a phone call, maybe the whole thing could have been headed off. Do you think that it was an avoidable conflict, or do you think that there were forces bubbling under the surface that made it, in a sense, inevitable?
Well, there's by now a kind of school of thought. 20 years ago, it was Neil Ferguson who wrote a book on avoidability, and just another book just came out with Christopher Clark, pretty much the more subtle, better evidenced. So, but the take on both is pretty much the same. The Brits should have accommodated rising Germany, and if they had done so, given Germany a place in the sun, as one of the shibboleths had it, it could have been avoided. I think that take ignores about half a dozen other conflicts in the neighborhood, which was tottering regimes who thought that war would save their regimes. It was the eternal conflict between Habsburg and Russia in the Balkans, which was one of the triggers of World War I. So it wasn't just German ambition and Russian and British kind of obtuseness. There was I don't want to go into this, but there were, let's say there was half a dozen conflicts which had nothing to do with the Anglo-German contest. And there was also, I think, this is my speculative take, I thought they were kind of all looking at war as a kind of release of all these tensions that had been building throughout the 19th century. And these idiots had not studied the American Civil War. The Prussians had, in some respects. So they had not studied the dress rehearsal of what was going to hit them. So they all thought we'd be home by Christmas. And they marched off at the end of August, they'd be home by Christmas. And by mid-September, they were stuck in trench warfare, which cost the lives of many millions. So if they had probably known, if they had had that crystal ball that told them what the world was going to look like in 1918, falling regimes, falling empires, whole generations laid waste, 12 million dead, 60 million after, they probably would have stopped. But at that point, we still thought, hey, wars are maybe going to be like the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71, or Germany's wars of reunification against Denmark and Austria. They thought it was a cakewalk. And so that too, I think, is one of the driving forces of the war, which is often ignored when we look only at the diplomatic conflicts.
Hello, my name is Bryce Watson. I was curious, there's a lot of research that shows that there's less violence, there's less death and murder as far as war and actually in complete statistics in the world right now. And so we're in a generally more peaceful era. And I was wondering, you said that after World War I, there was a lot of pessimism due to technology.
Yeah.
And the hope that people had in it, and it being betrayed because of the amount of death that came from it. Some people believe that the higher let me see how to put this. The technology we have today, the military is more specific and able to strike in very specific targets, and that's why death tolls have gone down, because we're not losing it. The war hasn't created as much of a death toll as it used to. That was necessary because of our weapons. But I was wondering, do we have a reason for optimism because of globalization and interconnectedness in the world? Has that created a type of mutually assured destruction, but rather through like finances rather than weapons?
That's a lot of questions, but let me just try to sort them apart. First of all, the last traditional big war we fought, not we, the world fought, is now 30 years, almost 30 years back, which is the Iran-Iraq War of 1980-88, the longest war, bloodiest war in the Middle East, maybe 1 million dead. It was fought with chemical weapons. Armies against armies, like World War II, like Korea. That was the last traditional war. Now, so if you count the number of traditional wars, you would say, hey, that's a cause for optimism. The downside is that war has been displaced from the classic battlefield to the insides of countries. So if you look around, I think 21st century warfare is going to be internal war. Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, who knows, maybe Egypt. And if you go to Africa, of course, it's internal war, has been internal war for the last 20 years. That is the new fate of war, which does not kill millions, but if you look at Syria, it kills hundreds of thousands. So in that respect, if you want to be cynical about it, hey, that's an improvement by an order of magnitude. At the same time, we, the West, we cannot control these wars. And that's why anybody in his right mind would say, do not get involved in Syria. You shouldn't have gotten involved in Iraq. You shouldn't have gotten involved in Afghanistan. We cannot win wars of internal order unless we're prepared to stay forever. Your last point has to do with precision ammunitions, drones, cruise missiles. And I guess special forces are also precision ammunition because they're small targeted forces which are a far cry from the kind of armies and divisions. Yes, we have scaled down war as when we fight it in the West. But I don't know whether one can call it war, what we're talking about. Taking out Al-Qaeda leaders, or sending the SEALs into Pakistan to take out bin Laden. I don't know whether we should call it war. It is certainly a form of modern violence that we don't quite understand. We can't really put it. I don't think we've developed any theories to understand that kind of warfare, what we are doing there. But to return to the basic point, yes, large-scale war seems to be disappearing, to be replaced by smaller scale, but more uncontrollable internal war.
Thanks, and we have time for one more question.
Awesome. I'm Marshall Yokel. I'm a fourth-year PhD student here in the history department. I actually work with Dr. Zeit. And my question for you, I was very struck by one of the last points you brought up in terms of one of the positive effects coming out of World War I. It's this idea of mass participation, particularly in politics. And you raised a very good point, women especially are gaining enfranchisement, which was unheard of prior to World War I. The question I ask then is, more and more people are participating in politics, however, at the same time in places like Germany, like Italy, like Russia, you're also seeing a sort of closing down of having the populace. You have the rise of, Hitler, and he's cutting off those who can actually have a say in the government, certainly in Italy with fascism. Even in the United States, while women will get the chance to vote, black people, African Americans, still are going to have to wait to really have a say. Yes, they can vote, but they don't have necessarily the same civil liberties as the white population, those of non-African American descent. So I guess the question that I pose to you then is, while there seems to be a movement towards this mass participation, why still is it going to take a number of years? Why does it still take a number of years for that really to take hold, really until maybe into the 1950s or 60s, where you really start to see the fruits of that coming out?
Okay, but you agree with the basic theory.
Yes.
Why does it take a long time? Because mass participation by hitherto disenfranchised groups has to kind of battle the status quo, which was a power status quo in which those who are in power rarely like to give up willingly or quickly. But the point I was trying to make, let me repeat it, is that mass war is a huge force multiplier. Civil War, World War I, World War II. Suddenly, you don't have to buy expensive Hessian soldiers anymore. You can get them for freebies almost, okay? And that changed the nature of war. But when they come back, they claim they do. This starts also in the Civil War. The Fighting Irish in the Civil War, that was the first step to Irish citizenship, full Irish citizenship. And remember, if you were Irish Catholic in this country, that was not a cool thing to be for a long time. But willingly, volunteering to fight in the Civil War, so the Fighting Irish, made a difference. And so was women in war, and so was blacks in war, World War II. It takes a while, yes. But you are right, but I'm right too.
I would hope that you are right. You're a much wiser man than I am. So.
On that note of consensus, let me thank Dr. Josef Joffe and thank all of you for coming.